Local programming on KRWG Public Media made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm your host, Anthony Moreno. Today, we discuss immigration and human rights along the border. Joining us is founder and executive director of the Border Network for Human Rights. Please welcome Mr. Fernando Garcia. Thank you so much for joining us.
Anthony, thanks for having me here.
I appreciate you taking the time because I know with everything going on, it's a very busy time for you. But I'd like to start off for our audience members who may not be familiar with your organization. Could you share a little bit about your organization, the history, and its mission?
Yeah, the Border Network for Human Rights was founded in 1998. So this year is going to be 21 years actually, since we were founded. And the Border Network was a reaction to massive human rights violations at the border at that time. At that time, we were facing immigration enforcement like never before. We were receiving a lot of complaints from communities in southern New Mexico and in El Paso about actions by Border Patrol and by ICE. And so what we did is we started putting together programs and trainings for our community to teach our border residents on how to deal with some of these issues, especially the potential violation of their constitutional rights. So we, on one hand, we produced a community education program, which essentially is to train community leaders so they can educate members of our community about something very essential, which is the Constitution of the United States. So we start teaching immigrant families and border residents about the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. I mean, what to do in case of a raid. So we started doing that 21 years ago. And also what we did at that time was to start collecting cases of abuse. I mean, so we can find patterns of abuses, but also at the same time make them public and then denounce the abuse of constitutional rights by law enforcement agencies. So those were the two tracks or why Border Network was created. And later on, I mean, we evolved as an organization and we started doing a lot of community organizing. So we did education, abuse documentation, but also we started creating a community network. So families, not only to teach them about their rights, so also at the same time giving them a voice and start fighting in this struggle for the defense and promotion of their human and constitutional rights. So those are being the essence elements of the Border Network for Human Rights.
So with your tenure at leading this organization and the work you're doing in communities here in the borderlands, what are some common things that you hear from communities that they might not know that is what their rights are?
Yeah.
What are some common ones?
Actually, you would be surprised, but I think I was very, I would say, taken back by the fact that not only immigrants but also U.S. citizens living at the border do not know about their constitutional rights. But it probably went a little bit beyond that. I mean, people at some point believe that because they live at the border, that they didn't have rights. I mean, their mentality was and now I can say it. I mean, it was more almost a mentality of an abused family. I mean, that the culture of abuse was permeating through families, through communities. I mean, there was this lie that if you were an immigrant, you wouldn't have constitutional rights, or you wouldn't have immigrant rights, or that's why your person and your dignity was not going to be respected. And when they produce or they repeat that lie many times, especially the climate, the enforcement agencies were telling people that they didn't have rights. So when people got the realization that they were human beings and that they were entitled to constitutional and human rights, that changed their lives. And also, it was very amazing for us.
Well, we're living in a time right now where civil rights, constitutional rights are constantly being brought forward with what is happening in our communities right now with President Trump and his administration's policy on enforcing immigration, their immigration policy and enforcement and the things they've been doing. What is your take on how border communities have been affected by President Trump's immigration policy and enforcement policy?
I mean, first let me say that what we had experienced in the last 30 years at the border, probably a little bit longer, it is the combination of two systems that are violating the rights of immigrants, but also border residents, I mean U.S. citizens and legal residents. On one hand, we had what I call expansive criminalization of immigrant families. What that means is that in the past, crossing the border without this inspection, it used to be an administrative violation. I mean, it was like passing the red light. I mean, that was I mean, you would break just a minor administrative law. Today, that is not the case any longer. So especially under this administration, people that crosses the border without no documents, it is treated as criminals. And we're talking about children, mothers, families being taken to jail and detention centers, and they are prosecuted. I mean, because the narrative is telling that they are potential criminals in that sense. So the expansive criminalization, and didn't start with Trump. I mean, I think we had also Democratic administrations that they contributed to this criminalization. Some of the criminalization codes that we have in the books right now started with Clinton at that time. And then the other system that grew out of that criminalization is what I call the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border. We never had in the past so many armed personnel and soldiers deployed at the U.S.-Mexico border like we have today.
Well, I mean, there was after September 11th, many people would say a lot of things changed here at the border in regards to that and Homeland Security being created, that department and things like that. Is that when you saw really the dramatic change in what you call militarization at the border?
That was one element of it. I mean, actually, militarization of the border it started early 90s with so-called seal the border operations. I mean, the militarization, the way that we need to understand it is, yes, it's the amount of people that is armed, protecting the border, let's say, for a minute, but also the mentality behind what is happening at the border. So after 9/11, we start this narrative of national security. Like this border became a national security area or zone or however you call it. And therefore, we start doing, I mean, the government after government, administration after administration start massively, a massive build up at the border. I mean, we start building walls and fences. I mean, that didn't start with Trump, I would say. We also had having increased the number of Border Patrol agents, deploying the National Guard at the border. In the latest, and this happened under Trump, I mean, this is about Trump, it is the deployment of active duty soldiers at the border under that idea that something is happening that is affecting our national security. Now, this is the question. If there's a threat to national security, then we need to ask what is that threat and what is that enemy at the end of the day to justify this build-up. And when we ask enforcement agencies in this administration, in the previous administration, how many terrorists have they detained in this U.S.-Mexico border, or people with the intention of committing a terrorist act in the United States? The answer is zero. There hasn't been a single incident of a terrorist threat in this border. So if terrorism is not a threat, then why we're doing all of these things. Some people would say that it's because of drugs
Or human trafficking.
or human trafficking, but in reality, that is, at the end of the day, doesn't justify this massive enforcement. Drugs, they come through ports of entry, planes and boats. So it is sad to come to the realization that this build-up is against immigrant families.
Do you feel, I mean, of course, President Trump ran on the immigration issue and building a wall along the border.
Yeah.
It's part of his campaign promise and what he's running. And of course, 2020 is just around the corner. So he's been pushing for funding for a border wall, and since he's really taken office. So with that, the immigration debate, do you feel that it is the center focus of it is right here in our area? Obviously, across the southwest border, there's issues, but it seems like, as far as like the national news goes, we've seen people from different perspectives of the immigration debate descend upon El Paso and Sunland Park, and no matter where you are on it, it seems like it's happening right here in our backyard, this immigration debate on what it's unfolding. So what would you say to people who don't live on the border in regards to what's really happening here?
We need to recognize and we need to say that the border has become part of the national discussion. I think that is true. I mean, it's part of the national political debate. Trump ran under this slogan of building the wall in 2016, 2020. Now he's changing it a little bit. He's actually claiming victory that he has built walls already, and he's moving to a new slogan, which is deport them all. So it is important for people in the interior of the United States to understand one thing. The first one is that words matter, and what the president has been telling since 2016, I would say until today, he's been telling a story of the border that doesn't exist. He's distorting the reality of our border communities. He's distorting the reality of immigrants themselves. He has been labeling immigrants as criminals and drug dealers and rapists. I mean, he ran under that assumption. And also, he's been talking about our borders in a way that is not happening. El Paso and Las Cruces are some of the safest cities in the nation. I would say that El Paso and Las Cruces are safer than Washington, D.C. However, there is this narrative that is telling that we're being invaded and there's criminals and there's a national security threat that has justified in the last 2 years strategies and policies that are hurting people, that are killing children. Well, and I think that's the problem. I mean, the problem is not only the rhetoric, it's the fact that the implementation of program and operations after operations, they are hurting a lot of people right now, and we can talk about it. But I think it's not about the rhetoric, it's about the implementation of like the Remain in Mexico program, putting children in cages, separating families.
Yeah.
It is.
And I want to talk with you about that because this is such a dramatic thing that's happened that we've seen unfold over the last year, and that is the rise in asylum seekers to our border, people seeking safety from, they no longer seek an asylum in the United States. So with this record number of asylum seekers that we've seen, what do you feel is really the thing that people need to understand what is happening right now? Because it seems like each week there's a new policy on how to enforce the border or asylum seekers.
A new bad policy or a new bad strategy. I think it's important to set the record straight. We don't have record numbers crossing the border. I mean, that is not true. I mean, if we go by the statistical information of CBP,
year by year, I mean, we've seen a rise, though. I know it's dropped recently in recent months.
In the year of 2000, Border Patrol arrested 1.6 million people along the U.S.-Mexico border. the year of 2018, 18 years after, under 400,000. That's their numbers. And yes, in 2019 there was a rise of refugees and asylum seekers. That is true, you know. But even if we count them all, we are not getting to the 1.6 million people that were crossing in the year of 2000. So I think it is important to say it, because the president is presenting the pictures of the caravans, saying we have a massive record invasion of immigrants and refugees. That is not true. What we are seeing, though, however, we are seeing less people trying to sneak into the United States and more people asking for asylum and refugee. I mean, that is true. I mean, the nature of immigrants that are coming is changing because of the conditions in Central America, especially in Guatemala and Salvador and Honduras, violence, economic depression. I mean, that in the past we have just men or young people coming to the United States. Now we have the whole family unit coming to us for refugee and asylum seekers. So that it is true. We had more families coming to the border asking for asylum.
With this many people seeking asylum, families seeking asylum, unaccompanied minors seeking asylum in the United States, do you think that this whole thing caught immigration enforcement officials off guard? Or do you think that this is something that...
Not at all, not at all. I think you need to remember that in the year of 2016, Trump ran under this false narrative that we had a crisis at the border. So this is almost a self-fulfilled prophecy. I mean, he created the conditions to appear that we had a crisis, and let me tell you why. Yes, at the moment that we had more asylum seekers coming to the border, many of them, actually most of them, if not all of them, they were coming to us asylum legally through ports of entry. So instead of having more asylum officers, which that would be the logical response to it, to have more asylum officers, to beef up the infrastructure at ports of entry, to start putting welcoming centers, if you wanted, to actually bring those families, protect them because they were fleeing from a number of situations, and then give them enough resources for them to follow their core procedure. I mean, that is what this is about. I mean, people come, apply for asylum, and then they had to go to a lengthy core process, hearings and stuff like that. So instead of strengthening that process, what Trump did was the opposite. First, he started the metering program. He started just letting some of them in sending back to Juarez and to Mexico, most of them, with the idea that they probably would get tired and go back to Guatemala or El Salvador. Secondly, I mean, essentially what he started doing is pushing those refugees to come between ports of entry, where Border Patrol was not ready for it. I mean, we need to recognize that. Border Patrol was there just to go after people that was trying to sneak into the country, but not to deal with asylum seekers and with families. And that is true. But that situation was created. I mean, instead of strengthening ports of entry and have more asylum officers, we just pushed them back to Mexico. So people got desperate, and instead of going back to their countries, they start crossing the border between ports of entry and turning themselves to Border Patrol. And that's where the crisis was created.
We've seen, obviously, some tragic stories unfold with asylum seekers, people in custody of the U.S. government dying due to the treatment, due to various illnesses, not getting adequate medical care, things like that. So I'm kind of curious, how does your organization respond, and what do you think needs to really happen so that we can prevent more deaths from happening with people who are seeking asylum or being detained by the U.S. government?
You know, when we heard about Jacqueline, that was the first Guatemalan girl that died in detention. We brought this to the attention of the public and of our community, and brought the attention to the government. And especially we were denouncing the conditions in detention centers. And at that time, we actually sent a warning saying that those conditions were going to lead to more children to die in detention, because what we collected out of the testimonials of talking to refugees and asylum seekers, because that's what we do. We go and interview them and ask them how they were treated, what some of the problems. And what we found was like a massive disregard of the rights, the dignity, and the well-being of people being taken into detention, into Border Patrol stations. In the past, we would say that was just one bad apple that was a problem in the case of abuse. But what we found was a systemic problem of abuse. It was just not one agent or one officer. It was systemically. I mean, the whole system was being abusive. I mean, deny of basic services, water, food to children, access to medication and to doctors. I mean, when that happened to Jacqueline, we started receiving other complaints about other children being in the same situation. Sick children were not being treated in detention centers and Border Patrol centers. So we warned about that situation. Few months passed after that, and we had 7 children that died. And I can tell you today that the underlying conditions in detention that led to those children to die in the detention centers, they're still there. They have not changed the conditions. We still receiving complaints of mistreatment, abuse, lack of services, and medical attention.
We've seen what's happened in the detention centers with the conditions. It's been highlighted with members of Congress, with Inspector General reports, and also with obviously the unfortunate news with the tragedies that have happened. What hope do you have in seeing this problem being resolved? I mean, because a lot of people say that law enforcement officials, immigration enforcement officials are overwhelmed at the border and are unable to really provide so many of these services. Do you think that other agencies need to step in as well with the U.S. federal government?
You know, and it is very sad that we're talking about the lack of resources and that we don't have food or medication for children because we don't have money. That is simply not true. I mean, if that was the case, Trump administration would be asking for so many billions of dollars to build a wall. I mean, they have the money to build a wall.
Yeah.
And he was just approved some extra money.
Yeah, we saw that. $2.5 billion.
Yeah, but we don't have money to get medication and treatment for children. I mean, that is ridiculous. That argument that there is no resources, that there is no capacity, that is a false argument. I mean, money, there is money. There's a lot of, not only in terms of governmental money, local entities, communities, they are helping. But I think this problem is not about resources. It's important, it's important to say it. This problem is about a policy and a strategy that intentionally is hurting people. We never seen so many bad things happening in our community at the same time as we now seen it during the Trump administration. And when I say that is because this is part of an agenda, an intentional agenda to harm people. I mean, a year ago, we were talking and discussing family separation. Tornillo was the major case of children were separated from their families, mothers and fathers. And at that time, the nation discovered that we had children in cages. People was angry and pushed back. The administration said that they were going to stop separating families. I can tell you today, we still have children separated from their families. So they have not changed.
We're creeping up on 2020. It's a presidential election year. I'd like to hear your thoughts on, do you think things are going to get worse or improve in the next year as somebody who's on the ground every day dealing with the situation?
we had seen one bad idea after the other to deal with these issues of immigrant and refugees coming from this administration. And to be honest, the more intense the political campaign becomes for 2020, the more dramatic the situation will become, because, I mean, Trump is using these issues of immigrant and refugees and the border as part of his political platform. And he has said it. Now we need to actually stop asylum seekers from coming into the United States. I mean, that is ridiculous. That is really violating international law, the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, violating long-standing traditions of the United States. However, the goal is not to have any asylum seekers to apply, and that is bad. And
you think that's the goal?
That is the goal, and again, he's using this politically. He's throwing red meat to his base, which is mostly a base that is, very racist, a base that is xenophobic, and I would say in some of them white supremacist. And I think he's just giving that to his base to actually try to get the votes that he needs. I'm not sure this is going to work again for Trump.
Why do you say that?
I think there are so many people that has been aggravated by what he has done at the border. I mean, and I think if there's any silver lining of what Trump has done in these 2 years, is that he's bringing people together against his policies. Yesterday, a few days ago, we had a major mobilization at the border where we had African American pastors, people from Jewish communities, white progressives, Indian Americans coming together like never before to denounce these policies and to actually express support in solidarity to refugees, but also asking for change. I mean, people is not willing to actually to stand without doing anything at this point. I mean, people is very concerned about not only what is happening with refugees, but what is happening with the rest of the country.
You bring up an interesting point. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I do want to thank you, Mr. Fernando Garcia, for joining us. He is the founder and director of the Border Network for Human Rights. We want to thank you for joining us on Fronteras at Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno.